so, all of that, I'm watching this as a pastor, and then Jordan Peterson pops up. And I had been, when Jordan Peterson popped up, I had been playing around with YouTube because I realized people don't read a lot of books, people in the pews. And so I'd been playing around with YouTube because I'd been thinking about doing some writing, but I thought, well, why am I going to, I see pastors write books that nobody reads.
Okay, yeah.
And so I thought, and Jordan Peterson pops up, and I'd also been I've been working through C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles, because that book had fascinated me for a number of years.
Okay, yeah.
And because I've been working through the question of what really is happening with our divided world. Because on one hand, we go to church, and Protestants over the last 100 years have had this major war over what on earth to do with, let's say, Genesis 1 and the cosmology there.
Right.
When you go to seminary, you start learning Hebrew, and you begin to play around with Genesis 1 and realize, well, what's a firmament? And you get this image out of Genesis 1 of this earth with a bowl, waters above, waters below. You recognize that some contemporary Bible translations are sort of fudging these terms in a lot of ways to sort of fudge the distance between the picture you might see in Genesis 1 and the picture we're all living with of being on this globe, going around the sun, and all this stuff going on. And I was really thinking about just the basic preacher task of trying to bridge these two worlds. Well, how do we really think about all of these facts? Okay, so you got Jesus' ascension. He goes up. What's that about? And so you start working through all of these things. And Jordan Peterson comes on the scene, and there's this whoosh. And I want to know what the whoosh is about. And part of it I could tell was this distance between these two worlds, these two images of our contemporary image of living on a globe, being hurled through space, this ancient image of the firmament and the waters above, and the throne room of God, and all of this geometry. And so what's this about, and why would whatever Jordan Peterson telling people to clean their room, why would that send people back to church? That's strange. And so he did a biblical series, so I start playing around with all of this stuff, and I begin to recognize that this the division of the worlds is a thing that might not be conscious to us, but is deeply beneath the surface.
Right.
And the more I began to wrestle with this, the more I began to see. Well, so then I was watching this debate between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, and Jordan Peterson was sort of describing the God that he acts as if he exists, and Sam Harris complaining about all this stuff Sam Harris always complains about. And I realized these two people are talking about two very different things.
Okay.
And I called them God number one and God number two.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to, figuring out Sam Harris's God number two was not hard.
Right.
Figuring out what Jordan Peterson was talking about has been significantly more work, but that very quickly put me on the hunt of exactly what you're writing about in this book. Because just today, in fact, there are a couple of YouTube celebrities who grew up evangelical in North Carolina and hit it big, and now live in LA as, not just YouTube celebrities, but comedians on a bigger stage. And just over the last few weeks, they have put out some videos and podcasts basically about their deconstruction of their evangelical faith. And for anybody who's been around in church, who has watched this happen through countless numbers of people, it's a fairly standard routine that they've gone through. But one of the things that through these last 2 years of working on this stuff, of paying very close attention, listening to people who grew up in the church, left the church, somehow got Jordan Peterson did something to them that nobody seems to know what happened, and we're all sort of guessing at. And of course, it's individual and it's different. I came to the real conclusion that God, what we think of as God deep in our guts, has been slowly changing dramatically for a very long time.
Right.
And for many people, reaches sort of a crisis point, and their rejection of a worldview necessitates, huge changes in all sorts of things of their life. And that very deeply gets into the fact that the ancients, when Christianity, so I've been reading a lot of history by Tom Holland, because I'm going to talk to him in a few weeks. What everyone understood as God has deeply changed, and we don't quite know what we mean by the words that we're using anymore.
Right.
And your book, and so this idea of sacramentality of your book, all of this is to me right on the money.
Okay. Well, okay. So let me take a shot at connecting some of the dots from the narrative you just shared to the book. So, because people are wondering, like, okay, doctrine of God, isn't this about, the Eucharist and some crazy medieval, Aristotelian logic scheme to make sense of the Eucharist? And some of the early work I have to do is to investigate how our God language shifted. And there's two shifts. There's a shift after Thomas. So Thomas is kind of the center, Thomas Aquinas. His articulation of transubstantiation is kind of the center of the book. But there's two shifts. There's a shift after Thomas, which between Thomas and the Reformation, which made Thomas's categories very difficult for the reformers to read and understand. But transubstantiation was necessary in the first place because of a shift that happened before Thomas. So in the early church, there seems to be no real debate at all about Christ's presence in the Eucharist. It's John chapter 6, Jesus is really sort of graphic language there. Living after the Reformation, we think, well, how did they not debate about this? Why doesn't this show up in like the Council of Ephesus, right? Why, when they were doing the early arguments about the nature of Christ, how come we weren't fighting about the Eucharist? And part of the reason is because everyone sort of culturally was a Platonist. And if you're a Platonist and you say, this is a symbol and God is really present and acting here, the Platonist says, yeah, that's how symbols work. And when that breaks down, you start getting questions in Western Europe, which never really happens, by the way, in Eastern Orthodoxy. It happens in the West.
Right. Yep. Where
people start asking, well, this Eucharist thing, is this a symbol or is this real? And the Platonist would say, yes. And the church...
Uh-oh. Zoom here.
Okay.
When, the Platonist would say yes, but the church, and right there you pause. So I don't know if you can go back there.
Yeah, the church in the 9th through 11th centuries is trying to figure out how to say something that was easy for a Platonist to say, but it's hard to say in Western Europe in the 9th to 11th century, which is, yes, there's a symbolic element. I mean, any anthropologist looking at Christians celebrating the Eucharist are going to say that the bread represents something and the wine represents something and the eating represents something and the prayer, like, it's obviously a symbolic nexus, but that doesn't mean it's not God's real presence. And so we need new language to do this in this new cultural context. And transubstantiation emerges to be able to say just that. And if to go into a little detail, the word substance actually becomes sort of the prime category for talking about something which is really, really, really real, maybe more real than the physical, but that is not easily identified with just the physical reality. So today we still live in a similar world where when we say real, we hear physical. And the church wanted to say the physical elements don't change. You can look at them under a microscope, you can put them in a mass spectrometer, you can do all kinds of things, and you will find the chemical reality of bread and wine. And still we are saying that this is the body and blood of Christ. And so how can you say that? Well, one way you can say that is to say, we actually all recognize in our everyday speech, whether we notice we're doing it or not, that we realize that there's a deeper reality than the physical. So when I recognize that you are Paul, 7 years ago, biologists tell us not one of the cells that is in your body today was in you. Like, we recycle our cells about every 7 years. Certainly the first cell that you were in your mother's womb is long gone. That one you probably weren't even born with that one. That was, but I identify something in you that is a principle of continuity and identity that is deeper than the physical reality, even though it's manifest through the physical reality. When I encounter the physical reality, I encounter things like color and texture and taste and smell and all that kind of stuff. But it's only my intellect that synthesizes all of those data pieces and identifies the deeper reality, which then I can recognize as persisting, even though some of those things change, right? I can paint a door a different color and I don't get confused and think it's a different door. I can actually recognize a persisting reality despite a physical change. Now, if we want to go into some changes change the reality. If I burn the door, then I don't have a door anymore. I have something else. So some physical changes can manifest a new reality, just like you dying. Now I don't say that's Paul, I say that's Paul's corpse, and that's a different kind of thing. But anyways, the point is that in our basic experience of reality, we recognize something deeper than the physical, that we intuitively know is more real than the physical. And substance is the language that Thomas Aquinas finds in Aristotle that helps him to communicate this. And well, actually, Thomas isn't the first one who finds it. The language of substance emerges a generation before Thomas that kind of solves a controversy at the time and enters official church teaching. And then Thomas is the one who really articulates it with such clarity that it becomes the sort of standard Catholic reference point for thinking about this. So that's substance, and then from it, transubstantiation emerges as a response to this shift in our attitude philosophically. But then after Thomas, substance itself undergoes a shift, and substance becomes what it is for you and me today. It becomes the physical stuff, the exact thing that Thomas was using it to not be.
Yes, yes.
And when you get to the Reformers 300 years later, transubstantiation starts to look like the opposite of what Thomas meant for it. It becomes a kind of physical or clandestinely physical, like you can't really see it, but that's because there's some kind of veil that hides it from us,
right?
Which is, Thomas insists that is not, like the Eucharist is not a deception. But in later medieval theologians, it becomes a kind of veil that God is putting over the flesh to keep us from being disgusted by it, all that kind of stuff, which Protestants reject. And I have to say, as a Thomist, Protestants were right to reject that. But what they were rejecting was something which had already transformed and didn't mean what it meant for Thomas. And if we want to now zoom out and go to this question of God, and I'm going to try, this is complex. I do this a lot in the book, but let's try to do it here. One of the things that happens just before Thomas is the Fourth Lateran Council says something like, we can speak about God using analogy. We can't speak about God directly. Our language is unequal to the task of God talk. But we don't despair of knowing true things about God and the mysteries of God. We can actually know true things about God. And when we speak in that way, we can only do it by analogy to things we know in creation. And then here's the key point that Lateran 4 says, but you must recognize whenever you're doing God talk and you're using analogy, that the difference between your articulation and the reality of God is greater than the similarity. So you can actually say true things about God, but you need to recognize the grave limits on what you're doing. And that when you say God is good and you say a watermelon is good, because you have an experience of the goodness of a watermelon, you need to recognize that there's an infinite distance between God's goodness and the watermelon's goodness, even though it is still true in a way to say that God is good. Now, this starts to break down after Thomas with the nominalist school, where they want to they reject analogy, or to some degree reject it, and say, no, we can say more or less direct things about God because there's a category beyond God against which we can measure both watermelons and God, and we'll call that category being. And once you do that, God is in the system. And this is Sam Harris's God. So the God that's in the system, and which can be measured against other things in the system, like watermelons, is now a God that is in competition with the system. So all kinds of problems that separate Catholics and Protestants that emerge at the Reformation, things like providence and free will.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Providence and free will becomes a problem when God is in the system, and one actor's will is measured against the other actor's will in a zero-sum game. So if God's will is done, then mine is not, or vice versa. Thomas Aquinas lives in a totally different world where he asked the question, does the reality of human freedom impede, God's will being done? And he just says so casually, he says, well, no, because God can choose to do his will through human freedom. And he says it as if it's almost self-explanatory.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
We look at it like, well, that's crazy. That doesn't make any sense, because we live in this world where God is in the system and in competition with the other parts of the system, rather than the God that transcends the system and therefore is not in competition with it. So to use an analogy from our own experience, and again, I'm using analogy, so it says something true about God, but its limit is greater than its truth. When I'm a parent and I engage my children at the level of their will, and I butt heads, right? And I say, like, my will versus your will, I'm going to try push, and I'm going to trump, and I'm the stronger one, so I'm the one who can lock you in your room and whatever. This is not satisfying. Even if I get my way, I do not feel actually free. I don't feel like my freedom has been vindicated because I crushed the weaker party in this conflict. But when, as a parent, I can engage a child in their freedom by reframing the question, or doing a kind of a distract and end run around whatever, and then both of us feel like we were engaged in our freedom and both of our needs can be met. When I'm more free, I can free the weaker party. And when I am less free, I butt heads with the weaker party, and then I resort to violence. Now, I'm not beating my children, but some kind of coercion, right?
Right.
In Thomas Aquinas's world, God is so free that God can engage us at our level of freedom and never have to coerce us. And so providence and free will don't butt heads. And God, now here's what God can do much better than I can do. When the weaker party screws up, God can even work through that. Now, maybe I can do that sometimes, I don't know, but that's the experience I have, is when it all goes well. And so maybe the analogy, part of where it starts to break down, is God is so much freer than I am, that even, I don't know, the murder of an innocent man by mob justice under a sort of calculating Roman procurator, even that disaster is something that God's freedom can engage to achieve God's purposes, right? And so anyway, that's the God that transubstantiation is trying to witness to. Because one of the questions in sacramental theology is, how do we measure the human reality of what we're doing over against the divine reality? So some of the reformers say, well, this is just a community act. we in our minds do what Jesus told us to do, and we remember. We do the work of remembering. It's a great irony that the Reformation, which is, you know, God's grace, God's grace, God's grace, ends up with a sacramental theology in at least some cases, not Luther, by the way, and Calvin is more complicated, but the what we might call the left wing, for lack of a better term, I don't know,
right.
The Swiss reformers,
right,
end up with a Eucharist where it depends on the humans doing the work.
Yep.
Which is very strange.
Yes, yes, yes.
But it only happens because God's work and human work are now butting heads, and they're in a zero-sum game. And transubstantiation is trying to witness to a world where it says God works through the human ritual, we have this beautiful line in our liturgy, fruit of the vine and work of human hands. These are the gifts that we present. They're both gifts of God, the grain and the grapes, but they're also human work. They're a product of human culture. And both the natural gift and the added value that human culture does in making those into bread and wine are transcended and become God's gift of himself back to us, right? And so we don't have to negate the human to affirm the divine. In the sacraments, we can say God is really the real fundamental actor here, but that is in a way that engages the human and the natural and the cultural, rather than as something that destroys or obviates or whatever the human and the natural and the cultural.
Well, that was, I'm going to use that in a video. That was tremendous. That was tremendous.
Well, I tried to do the hard work of the first chapter in, I don't know how long.
Oh, it was tremendous. You did it very well.